Someone said we've already watched this, but we'll see.
I'm Kento Bento.
This video is made possible by Dashlane. Download
Thanks to
Dashlane for
Anonymous
free
Bits.
if you never want to forget another password again at the link in the description. Aomori, Japan,
Thanks, Trippy.
1936. Prisoner Yoshie Shiratori had had enough. He was forced to confess to a murder he did not commit.
Oh, that's
Falsely
rough.
imprisoned in Aomori prison, beaten and tortured every night by prison guards, and now worse, prosecutors were seeking the death penalty.
I don't
In his
recognize
mind,
it so far.
It was time to go. But Aomori prison wasn't the easiest to escape.
Thanks to 5 gift subs,
Regardless,
DJ Lin, and
Yoshie
the tier 1
Shiratori
rice guy.
had nothing to lose.
Thank you,
And so
DJ
at
Rice.
5:30 a.m., he made his move. He knew there would be a 15-minute gap in the patrol time, as he had studied the guard's routine for months. And when the coast was clear, he pulled out a metal wire which he had smuggled in from the bathhouse and started to pick the lock. This was originally the metal support ring that was wrapped around the bathing buckets in
I don't remember
Mitsu's
this shit at all. Are
washer.
you sure we watched this one?
His hands were stiff.
Hold on. I do not think we've seen this. This isn't ringing any bells.
I'm Kento.
I thought what we watched was the, where it was like a heist. Yeah. We watched the $1 billion North Korean bank heist. That's what we watched. You guys are getting it mixed up. We never watched this, I don't think. But never mind. This also has a full bar. This doesn't look familiar at all. I remember this one. I remember this one very well. I don't remember this at all, and I was big into prison escapes. I still remember most of our prison escapes. Hey, thank you for the 10 gift subs, Liam. Thank you for the big drop, man. And thank you, Schwizard. Welcome. Yeah, of course I've watched the Wife Carrying Championship. There's a full bar because you're watching it. Well, I'm still gonna let it ride. If there's anything I start to recognize, we can stop, but I'm not sure.
From the wintry cold. But after a few minutes of picking, he had success, and his cell door swung open.
Yeah,
But
Barefoot
he wasn't
Bandit
out of the woods
days.
yet,
Fuck yeah.
Because there were more locked doors ahead. He knew he only had a few minutes left before the guards would return,
Thanks, Reese
and
Pepper.
so he wasted no time attempting to pick his way through the remaining security doors.
No
Now,
advice,
fortunately
Alex.
for him,
Just to keep
he was
yourself
able to make
distracted.
it out
It'll
of the
get easier.
facility.
Sorry
But
to hear that,
the
man.
bad news
Sucks.
was that he was only halfway to freedom. You see, he was still well within the search perimeter, which meant at any moment the alarm could go off and he'd still be caught. At 5:45 a.m., the guards returned, peering into his cell, and this is what they saw. Shiratori sound asleep in his futon bed. But of course, what they didn't realize was that they were looking at something else. A pile of loose floorboards underneath his duvet designed to trick them. It wasn't until the
Outsmarted.
next morning
Fuck yeah.
that they finally discovered the truth, and the alarm was sounded.
They get a
But by
duvet
then,
in that prison?
Shiratori was long gone. Now, he had escaped.
Thanks to
but
Prime
if you've
Heiser.
watched any of our previous videos, you'll know that things aren't always as
Congrats on the
it seems.
huge
In
job,
fact,
Parsket.
for
I'm
Yoshie
really glad to
Shiratori,
hear that, man.
aka the prison
You
break
deserve it.
magician,
Hope you enjoy it.
this was only the beginning. 3 days later, he was caught trying to steal supplies from a hospital, and just like that, he was back in the slammer. But this time, for his escape attempt, he was sentenced to life in prison. He would never
Shit.
be with his family again, his wife and his daughter, and all the months of planning had led to just 3 days of freedom. It now seemed he'd be locked up for a very long time.
Until
6
he
years
developed
later, in
superpowers.
1942, in the midst of the Second World War, Shiratori found himself transferred to Akita Prison in Akita City. There, the guards treated him even worse than
He's a
in
tier
Aomori.
1
They
Rothgar.
had heard about Shiratori's previous escape
The Recep
and were
Kuzan
determined to make
gift
an
sub
example
snack.
out of him. They wanted to make sure he would never escape again. Along with the usual
The Recep
beatings,
Magic and
he was
Arbiter.
forced to partake in extreme manual labor, made to sleep on the hard concrete floor in the severe winter cold, and placed into solitary confinement for extended periods of time. Now, this was a specially made solitary confinement cell, which was very small
Haven't
and
seen
had a
that,
very
Arbiter.
high ceiling,
We can get there,
with the
though.
walls covered with copper sheets so smooth that it was impossible to grip. In addition, there was almost no sunlight even in the daytime, with the only window light coming from a small sealed skylight high above. This was a room designed to keep escape artists from escaping, and if that wasn't enough, the guards also made sure that Shiratori was handcuffed at all times. Now, despite
God
the constant
damn.
abuse, one of the guards, Kobayashi, in fact the head guard, took pity on him Kobayashi never laid a
Aw.
finger and even seemed to check up on him from time to time, concerned
Just to make
for
out.
his well-being.
That's so
Perhaps
sweet.
this made life a little more bearable for Shiratori, and it might have even been what kept his will alive all the way to the night of June 15th.
Thanks. Appreciate
It
it,
was a
mess.
stormy night,
And yeah, we'll do more
Shiratori was
Yakuza
in the
soon,
middle
ish.
of one of his extended stays in solitary confinement. At around midnight, one of the guards peered into his cell and couldn't believe his eyes. He opened the cell door and looked around in astonishment, as Yoshie Shiratori had vanished into thin air. All that was left was his handcuffs. So how did he do it?
He actually
Well,
just straight
there were a
vanished.
few assumptions the guards made that did not apply to Shiratori. For one, handcuffs simply didn't work on him. Shiratori was actually a master of getting out of handcuffs, and in fact had several methods to choose from. Here, he decided to go with the familiar lock-picking method, but he really could have gone with any of them. He had thoroughly scoured his
Thanks for the
surroundings to
5
find
gifts, Liam. Thank you
anything
for the
that could be
generosity
of
tonight,
use
man.
in an escape. And
Thanks
just
for
like in
resubs, Zay
Aomori
and
prison,
DKD.
he was able to uncover a loose bit of wire. Perhaps it was from one of the items Kobayashi brought him, but this wasn't clear. After freeing himself from the cuffs, he placed his palms and soles of his feet on the smooth copper sheets and started climbing the unclimbable wall. It turned out Shiratori was also an expert climber.
So this
with
guy
an
just had
uncanny
maxed
ability
out fucking
to scale
stats.
like a lizard. Once he reached the skylight above, he noticed that, yes, the window was sealed, but the wooden framing around it was starting to rot. And so thereafter, night after night, when the guards weren't looking, he'd climb the copper walls and loosen the framing, bit by bit. Afterwards, he'd climb back down and place the handcuffs back on. This was
Oh,
not rapid
shit.
succession. After a couple months, the window finally came loose, and from there,
That's
it
so
was just
smart.
about choosing the right day. He waited until a particular stormy night, so the guards wouldn't hear the footsteps
Thanks
on
to
the
Prime,
roof. And
Sax, and
that
resub
was it.
Sontag.
He had
Fuck yeah,
escaped
man.
from
Hope you're doing
prison
well.
again. Now this time, he wouldn't be caught. Or, at least, not in the way you'd expect. 3 months later, on
He
September
became the
18th,
warden of
the
that
head guard,
prison.
Kobayashi was at home when he heard a knock on the door. To his surprise, it was the fugitive Yoshie Shiratori, unkempt and disheveled, and he needed a favor. A stunned Kobayashi took him in and fed him, all the while listening to what he had to say. Shiratori explained that he didn't actually mind being in prison, and that the only reason he escaped twice now was due to the tremendous abuse he suffered at the hands of the sadistic guards.
Makes sense.
Kobayashi, however, was the only one who treated him with any amount of respect, and so he felt he owed it to him to let him in on his grand plan. Now, this plan involved Shiratori willingly, yes, handing himself over to the Justice Department, where he could then personally make a case for how corrupt and barbaric the Japanese prison system was, and there needed to be reform. He wanted
Why?
to campaign for change, and in the process, gain his legal freedom through a
Thanks to
civil
5 resubs
lawsuit.
again,
He
Liam.
felt this
Goddamn,
was
man.
the only way he could
And yeah,
realistically
2
end
people,
up
Lemon.
with his family. This, of course, was
And maybe
a super
Grapey.
ambitious plan, and as a fugitive on the run, he was well aware of it.
And we watched
which
that a
is why
while
he
ago,
needed
Sloth.
Kobayashi, the
That's a great video.
well-respected head guard of Akita Prison, to vouch for him, to strengthen his credibility. As the only guard who ever treated him right, he had a feeling Kobayashi would do the right thing. Minutes later, while Shiratori was in the toilet, Kobayashi called the police. Maybe not a great plan. Just like that, Shiratori was back in prison.
Yeah,
And this
awful
time,
plan.
He vowed never to trust an officer of the law again. For the second
Yeah.
escape, the courthouse added 3 more years to his life sentence. Now, Shiratori requested to be sent to a Tokyo prison, where the weather was warmer, as he couldn't stand the cold in the northern prisons. His previous stints had weakened him severely, but he was denied his request. Instead, the judge sentenced him to the infamous Abashiri prison in Hokkaido, the northernmost prison in Japan.
Good
no
God.
man had ever escaped from this wintry hellhole of a prison. It was now 1943, and the cold was unbearable in Abashiri, as the temperature in the cells was below freezing point.
Thanks to the
Whenever
gift of
inmates
Dennis.
received their prison food, the miso soup and soy sauce would often freeze up. In this temperature, a handcuffed Shiratori was thrown into an open cell in summer clothing, and he immediately felt the paralyzing sting of cold air. Perhaps in a fit of desperation,
Thanks,
he
Rishabh
tried
Ravi.
to force himself past the guards, but they were able to push him back and beat him down. An enraged and defiant Shiratori stood back up and vowed that he would escape from Abashiri prison, like he's always done, and that there was nothing they could do about it. In fact, he
They could
claimed
kill him.
there was little point even putting handcuffs on him,
No,
as
Dad,
he'd always
I'll
find a
come say
way
goodnight in a
to
sec.
break free. If not by lockpicking, then, well, this. He then proceeded to rip apart the chain
What?
of his handcuffs, to the horror of the guards. It turned out Shiratori had another special ability. Aside from his outstanding climbing abilities, he also possessed incredible strength.
This is a
Almost
lie.
Superhuman
Straight
strength.
up, this is
Back
made
in
up.
Akita prison, he could have broken free of the cuffs the
Exit
physical
Prime
way
memes.
if he didn't have to put them back on. Now, this was impressive,
I'm sorry I didn't see
but
that,
it
Tam,
wasn't
but yeah,
so
I did
smart
watch
to
the
lay
trailer.
his cards on the table like that, as the guards were starting to build an escape profile on him. They knew he had lock-picking abilities, lizard-like climbing
Exit Prime
abilities,
Martin.
and now almost superhuman strength.
No,
And so
this is
they
a
set out
lie.
to devise the ultimate escape-proof cell, one that was sure to be Shiratori-proof. And they came up with this. The new cell had steel fixtures with a low chance of rot. Any openings, even the bars removed, were made smaller than his
He can
body,
also
meaning
run
there
at
was no
90
way
miles
he
per
could
hour.
physically fit
Yeah.
through. He had specially made solid iron handcuffs
He utilizes
that
the
tied
Speed
his
Force to
hands
turn
behind
back
his
the clock.
and leg cuffs that made him barely able to stand. These cuffs weighed 20 kgs each and had no keyhole, which meant they could not be lockpicked. And the only way they could be removed was by two metalwork specialists who would come once every few weeks to remove them in an arduous 2-hour process. It was at this point, and only this point, that he could even take a bath. And he certainly needed one, as weeks of being shackled up with no movement meant his cuff wounds were infested with maggots. On top of that, and as cold as it had already been, it wasn't even peak winter yet. Any strength he would have left would surely be nullified by
Is
the
the Prime
upcoming
Clicky,
freeze. Though just in
Martin, and
case,
the Tier
they
1
still made sure to
Umbrella
cut his already
Girl,
meager
and the
food
Tier 1
portions in half.
One
And
Deal.
so that was it. Even for Shiratori, this was too much.
Maybe
As winter
Chainsaw.
came, he succumbed to his fate. Every day, the guards would slide his meal through the opening, and he'd be forced to grovel like a dog. His hand and leg cuffs made every action awkward and uncomfortable, with even sleeping being a pain. There was no doubt life in Abashiri prison was absolute torture. Now, fast
Thanks to
forward,
Austin,
Shiratori
Resub Bell.
was somehow able to survive through the winter, and spring was coming. This meant he was starting to get his strength back. But still, what could he really do? He was literally in a bind. Months passed and, well, nothing seemed to happen. Then one night, in August, a guard in his office was doing some paperwork when he heard some shuffling on the roof. He wasn't sure what it was, but he decided to check on the prisoners. As he looked inside Shiratori's inescapable cell, he was stunned. The futon bed and
There was
prison
5
garments
women
were
in
neatly
there,
folded up,
and no
with specially
Shiratori.
made 20 kg handcuffs and leg cuffs that would have required two specialists 2 hours to remove was placed on the side, and Shiratori was nowhere to be seen. He had finally fulfilled his promise to the guards. The alarm immediately
Turns out he
sounded,
was working
but
for the
despite
prison
work
in
of the search
disguise. He
party,
escaped
it
like a
seemed
week
he had
ago.
truly disappeared. But how on earth did this happen? How did he escape from the fortress that was Abashiri prison?
Thanks to the Prime Sketchbook.
Well, preparation had started 6 months earlier.
Thank
At
you,
the time,
Liam. Goddamn.
He didn't have the strength or stamina
Thank you for
to
the
mount
5
any
gift subs,
sort
man.
of escape, not to mention the restraints he was in. But one thing he did have was time and patience. Every day, the guards would slide his meal through, and while he struggled to eat his food off the floor, he always made sure to save a little bit of the miso soup in the corner. You see, every night, he would hobble awkwardly to the inspection window and splash a little of it on the steel frame. He would also dab some on his handcuffs and leg cuffs. Now, his intention was for the salt content of the miso soup to oxidize the screws and bolts, eventually
What?
corroding and loosening it.
That
After a
wouldn't
month,
work.
This technique of rusting through the iron actually worked, and the first
No,
screw
there's no
the
fucking way
next
that
few
would
months
work.
saw screws and bolts coming loose,
Unless they're
assisted
giving
by
him
use
like
of
the
first
fucking
screw as a sort of
saltiest
screwdriver.
miso of all
By the end of
time.
spring, he was
I mean, I
able
guess.
to fully remove his handcuffs and leg cuffs, as well as the steel frame of the inspection window. But there was a problem. The size of the opening was smaller than his body, which meant he couldn't fit through, a contingency thought out by the guards. What they didn't account for, though, was Shiratori's fourth ability, which involved being able to dislocate his joints at will. With this, he was now able to slide through the opening like a caterpillar. This repertoire of skills, thus surely making him an honorary member of the X-Men. With that,
This
he
is
climbed through a broken window
fanfic.
in the roof.
It's like a
and
Death
vanished.
Note chapter.
Impressively, Shiratori had now escaped from 3 prisons, as well as being the only man to ever escape Abashiri prison. Now, good on him for escaping, but this was northern Hokkaido, and the only
Thanks to
direction
Tier
he
1
could have
Narwhal
gone to
and
was
resub
the cold,
back
snowy
Thanos.
mountains. Actually, the prison guards felt that they had the last laugh, because if the cold didn't get him, the mountain bears certainly would.
But he had a fifth
Despite this
ability.
likelihood,
The
there was
ability
one
to
person
control the
who
minds of
stayed
bears.
hopeful, and that was Shiratori's wife. but she was still worried, because even if he was alive, she knew he wouldn't be able to make it back to his family, as the authorities would be constantly on his tail. Which is why she was desperately and secretly hoping that Japan would lose the war, as that would enable the
Sorry to hear
US
that,
to
Wick.
take over the
I
country.
stream daily,
meaning
but no schedule.
Everyone would likely forget about her husband. Of course, she kept this to herself, but then a year later, in August 1945, she got her wish.
He's the Prime Slam. His fifth ability, wife. Yes.
The Americans had now taken over the country's penitentiary system, and sweeping changes were being made. And it did seem, perhaps, that the manhunt for Yoshie Shiratori had now taken a back seat. Yet the question remained, where was he? And was he even alive?
Is
The
he
answer
Tony?
was yes, he was alive, and living a solitary life. This time, self-imposed. It turned out he had discovered an abandoned mine on a mountainside in the Hokkaido wilderness, and was able to make a home for himself. For food, he lived off nuts and berries, wild rabbits and raccoons, and was even able to learn to catch crabs from a stream by observing the habits of bears. Life was steady and safe, but after a while, curiosity got the better of him, and so after 2 years of isolation, he made his way down the mountain to a nearby village. What he saw astounded him. The streets were filled with signs written in English, the posters and flags emblematic of the war
And
effort
that's
had
how he
vanished.
became
And even
president
more
of
strange,
Japan.
Young Japanese girls were holding hands with American soldiers. What on earth was going on? He grabbed a newspaper that had been set aside, flipped through the pages, and it was only then that he found out about the atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan had surrendered the previous year, and he couldn't believe it. As with his
I
wife,
said that
he
earlier,
felt it was
Slav.
now
We've watched
pointless
Ray's
to
Last
hide,
Jump.
and
Long
so
time
bid
ago. I made a
farewell
video
to
on
his
Ray's
old
Last Jump, too.
hunter-gatherer lifestyle. He headed south of Abashiri for the next 50 days, until he reached the city of Sapporo. At this point, he was starving, so he found himself a nice ripe tomato from a nearby field, which was a huge mistake. A farmer had spotted him and mistook him for a well-known local thief, which led to a scuffle, resulting in the farmer's abdomen being pierced by a blade. Sadly, he bled out and died. But not before Shiratori was arrested for the crime. It wasn't long until police found out that they in fact had the infamous Yoshie Shiratori in their custody. For his
This shit
multiple
is super
escapes and
fake.
having
No
now
fucking
murdered the
chance.
farmer, despite his claims of self-defense, he was sentenced to death by the district court of Sapporo. And in 1947, he was sent to Sapporo prison to await execution. Now, to ensure he wouldn't escape this time while on death row,
Exit Tier
he was
1
placed
Master
under
Chef.
24-hour surveillance, with 6 armed guards personally assigned to his watch. As for the cell itself, it was upgraded further from the one in Abashiri prison, with reinforced doors, ceilings, bars, windows. In fact,
How would
many
he get
openings
arrested
were
for a
made smaller
farmer's
than
death in the middle of
size
fucking
his head,
nowhere?
not just his body, learning from the
It's
other
not like it's
escape.
GTA
As while
RP
he
where
may
it
be
gets
able to
instantly
dislocate his
reported.
joints, he certainly can't dislocate his skull. As long as his head can't fit, they were good. The 6 guards were so confident, in fact, that they didn't even bother cuffing him. Now Shiratori was getting old, and the odds of escaping by this point were looking slim. As his execution loomed near, there was little he could really do, and the guards knew that. They could see the desperation on his face, looking up, searching for an escape plan that they knew would never come. Though still, just in case, they made sure to search his room every night while he was taking a bath in the bathhouse, inspecting the ceiling, skylight, and any other openings. A month passed, and winter was now coming, weakening him further, and the realization was starting to dawn on him. He grew increasingly despondent, staying in bed, refusing to wake up.
But this was
despite
all an
the orders
act.
of the guards. This went on for a while until one morning the guards had enough and entered the cell to discipline him. They flipped over the duvet and he was gone. This was not possible. How did he do it this time? Going back to when he was first placed under 24-hour surveillance with the 6 armed guards personally assigned to his watch. He had in fact conditioned them
His
to
fifth
look up
ability?
and keep up
Shape-shifting.
from the very start.
In fact, he never
Not just
left.
because his previous escape
He was one of the
attempts involved
floorboards.
climbing through skylight windows on ceilings, but also his suspicious yet, as it turned out, very intentional behavior of constantly looking up to figure out an escape plan. Little did they know, it was all an act, and that he already had one, but it would be taking place precisely where they weren't looking. You see, it turned out the authorities were so concerned with him escaping
Thanks, we
through a
said
window
Pharaoh
or
and Sonny.
skylight that they neglected to reinforce the bottom. This ironically ended up being his easiest and simplest escape because all he had to do was remove the bolted floorboards, which wasn't easy but he had experience, and using random cutlery and a miso soup bowl, dig his way to freedom.
Yeah, but they checked
This
his
took over
cell
a
every
month,
night, and how did he
was able to hide his
unbolt the
activities
floor?
Due to A, the guards not suspecting this approach, and B, the floorboard panels being put back in place every night after digging. The 6 guards thought they were keeping a good eye on him even at night, but with the hole consistently positioned underneath the futon and duvet, and it increasingly becoming the norm to refuse the orders of the guards to wake up, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Placing a pile of loose floorboards underneath the duvet to trick them was also a callback to his first prison escape in Aomori. So he had now escaped from
Pintelli.
prison 4 times, and by this point, the story is starting to get ridiculous. But
Also,
this
the dirt
perpetual
has to
cycle
go
of
somewhere.
Capture and escape, capture and
Where did he
escape
put the
was
dirt?
about to end. Because a year later, in 1948, Shiratori was exhausted. He was in his 40s now, and this
He
was
ate
a
it.
young man's game. One day, in the Kotoni neighborhood, still in Sapporo, as he stopped to rest, a policeman just happened to sit by his side for a smoke. He didn't know who Shiratori was, but he struck up a conversation with him.
Thanks for your
Shiratori,
sub
of
feels.
course, was wary of his presence and tried to play it cool, all the while attempting to figure out a way to remove himself from the situation without being suspicious. Suddenly, the policeman did something unexpected, at least to him. He pulled out another cigarette and offered it to him. Shiratori was stunned. You see, cigarettes were expensive luxury items in Japan at the time, and the fact that someone offered it to him just out of the kindness of his heart brought tears to his eyes. Not to mention all his life he had been abused and mistreated by officers of the law, with even the head guard Kobayashi turning his back on him. And here was an instance of an officer treating him kindly, with respect, and with no prejudgment. As he smoked the cigarette, Shiratori couldn't help but tell the
It was
officer
laced.
his full name, Yoshie Shiratori, and that he had escaped from Sapporo prison last year. In fact, he had escaped from prison 4 times in his life. It was strangely a relief to get it all off his chest, and he was even ready for the consequences. After the Kobayashi incident, he had vowed never to trust another officer of the law again. But the simple act of receiving
Thanks
a
for your sub,
cigarette
Big
from a
Weenus and
stranger
Eve
broke
and
him.
Lost Boy.
Of course, he was arrested again. But this time, things were different. Maybe it was the fact that he willingly gave himself up, or that Japan's justice system was going through a change. But the High Court of Sapporo became sympathetic to Shiratori's plight, and some of his past claims were recognized, such as acknowledging the farmer's death as a legitimate case of self-defense. They also made note that throughout all 4 of his prison escapes, he didn't kill or injure a single guard, despite the abuse he may have suffered at their hands. At the end of the deliberation, the High Court dismissed the murder charge, revoking his death sentence, and instead sentenced him to just 20 years in prison.
Aww.
Further, they approved his request to be transferred to a Tokyo prison,
Where he
the
broke
weather
out
was
again.
warmer. He was getting what he wanted. In Tokyo, he was sent to Fuchu prison, where, for the first time, the guards actually treated him well. It was a weird feeling. There were all these precautions and security measures in place to ensure that the infamous prison break magician wouldn't escape. But the truth
Where
was,
he fought
Shiratori
Baki.
didn't really care anymore. Everything he'd been fighting against, the mistreatment from guards, the death penalty, even the northern climate, was no longer of concern. And he was at peace. There was no need to escape anymore. He finally accepted his punishment, and for the remainder of his sentence, acted as a model prisoner. Just 14 years later, in 1961, he was released on parole, and for the first time in a long time, he was truly a free man. He decided to head back to Aomori, where it all began, and meet up with his daughter, who, by this point, unfortunately, was the only family member he had left. For his incredible escapes, Yoshie Shiratori became a legend, an anti-hero in Japan. But it was very much the opposite for the country's penitentiary system, which had somehow allowed him to escape time and time again. This was a national embarrassment for Japan. But just as preventing criminals from breaking out of the system
Thanks to the tier
is vital
2,
for
Monk.
the safety of society,
Or
so
Monkey.
is
Thanks to
preventing
the tier
them
2,
from
Monkey.
breaking into the system. Your system, that is. And for that, I'd personally recommend Dashlane.
Oh,
Because
son of a
Dashlane
bitch.
makes
The
keeping track
Shiratori
of
use
all your
Dashlane?
passwords super duper easy.
Dashlane is good, though. So, I don't believe any of this, to be honest. How do I spell his name? Shiratori, maybe? Oh, here it is. Yoshie Shiratori. The prison escapes may have happened, but the way they happened absolutely cannot be real. I'll watch the follow-up, but the one that really sticks out to me is his fourth one.
And simplest escape, because all he had to do was remove the bolted
He dug himself out of prison using a miso soup bowl in a place where he was being monitored 24 hours a day. This dirt has to go somewhere. So where was he putting all of this dirt? He just ate the dirt. There's no fucking chance he ate this much dirt. He would go septic. No fucking way. He would absolutely, at some point, die from it. That'd be way too much dirt. Unless, again, that was one of his superpowers, turning dirt into nutrients. But here, we'll watch the follow-up, see if they answer those questions. Because I don't believe it. In the toilet? But they'd hear him flushing the toilet. Constantly. If there even was a toilet to flush. Or they'd hear him or see him constantly going over to the place where the toilet is. Windows? That wouldn't work either because there'd be dirt all on the windows. And he's being monitored 24 hours a day. He'd have to take the miso soup bowl up and throw it out the window, go back down and do this time and time again. He'd have to keep going in and out, which increases the chance that he gets caught. But we'll watch this and see if it answers it. I'm going to go say goodnight to Tiana real quick, though. Thanks for the gift sub, Cavi, and resub Pioneer, and Actor. That's, I was talking about that the other day. She's new addition to the team. Her name's Chelsea. Is that a suggestion gaming, or is that like a video thing? And yeah, quite a bit ban list. Thanks for the bits, Manic. I'll be right back. Alright, team. I'm back. Thanks to the Prime Respawn Gamer and Unknown Guesser. Unknown Guesser and Tier 1 Scumbag Punks and Resub Squirrel, Cookie, Fruit Loops. I guess Sub Quantum and Tier. Oh, and Resub Soda Pop. We've seen that Stinging Caterpillar one, by the way. And thanks to Resub, Josh.
This video is made possible
Prime,
by
Alec.
CuriosityStream. By signing up at the link in the description, you'll also get Nebula. I assume you've already watched the incredible Japanese Prison Break.
Just finished
And,
it.
As it turns out, many of you had some lingering questions that needed answering. Like, where did all the dirt go?
Hey, that's what I
Anyone break
said!
Handcuffs with their bare hands. Why didn't anyone see the
Handcuffs
rust
could have been
after
frozen.
using the miso
I
soup?
can believe
How
that
can you
one.
add 3 more years to a life sentence? What exactly was Shiratori's initial crime that led to his first arrest? What happened in his life after being released from prison? Was this whole
Thanks to
video
Tier 1
just an
Brax,
ad, bro? And
the
as a
Prime
bonus,
Spooby.
what's the next Kento Bento video going to be about? We'll get to all of that, but by far the most common question was,
Where did all the dirt go?
So let's start with that.
Thanks to Resub,
This is
Mig,
the scene in question.
Bob
the setup
Goblin,
for
Big
the fourth
Ski.
and final escape. The illustration shows
Sorry to hit a pause, champ. Nolix, it's good to see you again, man. Holy shit, dropping you in fucking fatter gift subs, my man. Good lord. Thank you for the huge 100. Holy shit. God damn. Thanks to the bits Manic and gift sub Noodle Boy. And thank you for the bits, Jacob. My week's been alright. Fuck, Nolix, thank you. Thanks to the resub Big Mex and the Prime Nova. Have a good night, Falcon. God damn.
shows him
Thank you.
burrowing straight down beneath the floorboards. But how can that be if there was no place to hide the dirt? Well, this guy thinks the only possible explanation is that he must have eaten it. Others have suggested that Shiratori must have pulled a Shawshank Redemption and over time emptied it in the yard. But as far as I'm aware, he was in isolation at all times.
Thanks to
So
2 gift
that's
subs,
probably
Butter,
not what happened.
the Prime Creator.
No, the answer is actually pretty simple. Just as with most building structures, the foundation of the cell isn't built directly on the surface of the soil, which means there was more than enough room underneath the floorboards for the dirt to fit. And sorry that this wasn't clearly illustrated in the drawing, but let's all blame Charlie the illustrator for that. Another common remark was that this video must be fake. since
I
there's no way
see.
anyone can
That
get
makes a
handcuffs
lot
with their
more
bare
sense.
hands. Well, this
I didn't
has
even
all
think
been
of that.
documented. And of course, what makes this story worth telling in the first place is precisely because it doesn't seem real. But specifically about the handcuffs, remember, these were cuffs from the 1930s. In Japan,
Thanks to the
breaking
Quantum
them
and
isn't too
Resub
absurd an
Rebellion.
idea when you consider, and I'll quote this Reddit user, that Japanese iron at the time wasn't especially pure, mostly deriving from iron sand, which has a ton of impurities. It's likely Shiratori could snap the cuffs along the weak link. And on top of that, we know Shiratori had immense strength, making this all the more plausible. But what about his escape from the
Somebody's like hitting their car with a sledgehammer right now.
the 20 kg solid
Weird.
iron handcuffs and leg cuffs after using the salty miso soup? Why didn't anyone notice the rust? Those metalwork guys apparently came every couple weeks or so to remove his cuffs so he could take a bath. By the way, sorry about the maggot shot. So why didn't they see anything? Well, the rusting was intentionally made obvious in the illustrations to demonstrate clearly what was going on. That was my call. But in reality, it wasn't so visible. And the way the specialist removed the cuffs every few weeks was by breaking apart the actual metal. So they never actually paid too much attention to the screws and bolts. Okay, so this one was kind of surprising to me. Quite a few people asked, how could there be 3 more years added to a life sentence, as was the case for Shiratori after his second escape? No, this wasn't a mistake in the script, nor does it mean that the prison keeps the corpse 3 years after death. Rather, the answer
That'd
is
be kinda
that
cool.
a life sentence is not what you think it is. A life sentence or life imprisonment can mean, yes, inmates remain in prison for the rest of their natural lives. But it could also mean for a fixed period of time, or until they are paroled. In 1930s Japan, I believe this period was at least 10 years. Nowadays, it's increased to about 35 years. And this may also help you understand how some criminals can be given multiple life sentences, like 2 or 3 or even 10.
How
for
about
the
we
more
just
severe
change the
crimes. Or, as
nomenclature
the
and
case
stop
with
calling
Terry
them life
Nichols, an
sentences?
accomplice in the Oklahoma City bombing, 161 consecutive life sentences. Okay, then what exactly was Shiratori's initial crime? The one that got him imprisoned in the first place? This was asked a lot in the comments too, even though I actually addressed it at the very beginning of the video.
Thanks to Resub
Prisoner
Bards and
Yoshie
Tier 1
Shiratori
Blaze.
had had enough. He was forced to confess to a murder he did not commit. But just to elaborate on this, Shiratori had a rough upbringing after his father died and his mother abandoned him at the age of 2. And he later found himself involved with
Thanks
a
to Tier
bad
1
crowd,
Tigray.
or seemingly some sort of gang, which may explain how he developed such skills as lockpicking, handcuff breaking, and prison parkour. Now, it was apparently these people who were the ones responsible for committing the murder, not Shiratori, but he made the mistake of tagging along. After they were all arrested, what happened was that the group turned on him and claimed he was in fact the murderer, and along with the police beating a false confession out of him, became the fall guy, and he was quickly convicted. Now that's apparently the story, but the circumstances surrounding this was too ambiguous for the courts, which is why he was still sentenced to 20 years at the end, as
He's
he
the prime
was cleared
toxic
of the
waste.
farmer's murder, a legitimate case of self-defense, but not the initial murder. So all that was what led to the events at the start of the video. As for what happened to him 28 years later after being released from Fuchu prison, by the way, this was the same prison that was referenced in the 300 million yen robbery that I covered in the Japanese bank heist video, a famous heist that took place 7 years after Shiratori was released from prison. I already touched on this a little with him meeting his daughter, which was a nice note to end the video on, but according to some sources, it appears, unfortunately, that his relationship with her was somewhat strained.
Thanks to
Which
Resub
isn't all
Underside.
that surprising considering the stigma in Japan of having a relative in prison, and her never actually meeting him before. So after his release, yes, he was happy to see her, but he later ended up bouncing around Japan doing odd jobs in various
Thanks
cities,
to Resub
mainly
Fan and GTA,
construction
make it
work.
sub Reggie.
And actually, why don't I play you the alternative ending that wasn't shown on YouTube, but only on the Nebula streaming platform? Just 14 years later, in 1961,
Ah,
he
director's
was
cut,
released
the Snyder
on
cut.
parole. And for the first time in a long time, he was truly a free man. He decided to head back to Aomori, where it all began, and meet up with his daughter, who, by this point, unfortunately, was the only family member he had left. For his incredible escapes, Yoshie Shiratori became a legend, an anti-hero in Japanese popular culture, read about in books and depicted in movies. And even though Shiratori passed away in 1979 at the age of 71, his legacy lives on, perhaps the most, in the one place he wanted to leave more than any other, Abashiri Prison. Or at least what has now become the Abashiri Prison Museum.
Oh, we saw
where
this.
Shiratori has been immortalized.
This was on the
as a
Wikipedia
mannequin
page.
display simulating his renowned miso soup escape.
That's pretty cool. They should put a massive cock on him.
So I was able to end the video this way, letting the story breathe,
Thanks to
because
Prime
new
Fin
Kenta
Fin
Beta
and
videos
Resub
all
Super.
go up on Nebula completely ad-free. Thousands of high-budget Sonic did Game of Thrones, Patrick H. Willems, and experiment on our own terms. We've only just started, but it's a mystery, the
Holy
Great
shit,
Train
this is like
Robbery, the Real War of
Wait, this is
Crime,
actually like a
Japan
7-minute
Samurai
ad.
Car, which makes this one all the more fast with myself and revealing the title, as plans can always change, but I will say it's somewhat Halloween-inspired.
God damn. Yeah, that was good. I do not think we watched that ever. None of that ringed any bells. What might have happened is we started it and then abandoned it.